Early efforts to introduce modern agriculture to Korea.
This segment aims to examine how colonial agricultural science was implemented in Korea, focusing on the transplantation of Japanese agricultural techniques, research institutions, and their impact on Korean farming practices and rice varieties. Right after 1876, when Korea opened its door to foreign countries, the Joseon government made various efforts to introduce modern agricultural science. In 1883, after the Bobingsa delegation's tour of the United States, Hong Young-sik proposed to King Gojong the establishment of a model farm. The Joseon government accepted this proposal and in 1884 established an agricultural and livestock experimental station near present-day Tuksum, placing its management and operation under Choi Kyung-seok, who had visited the United States as an escort to the Bobingsa delegation. Choi cultivated the seeds of grains and vegetables imported from the United States and purchased various pieces of agricultural equipment. He tested Western agricultural techniques, compiled the result for publication, and ordered livestock from the United States to test the potential for dairy farming. However, after Choi's unexpected early death in 1886, the station was effectively abandoned. In 1887, the Joseon government established a 2-year agricultural affairs school and hired British agricultural technician Earl Jeffrey to manage the demonstration farm and ranch. Unfortunately, Jeffrey also passed away suddenly in the summer of 1888, after which the farm and ranch were abandoned. The Korean Empire government established a sericulture experimental station under the Ministry of Agriculture, Commerce and Industry in 1900. In 1904, Department of Agriculture was opened in the School of Commerce and Industry, renaming it the School of Agriculture, Commerce and Industry. In 1905, the school established its own agricultural and horticultural experimental stations in Tuksum. However, those efforts could not achieve significant results, as it was a tumultuous time marked by the loss of national sovereignty. In 1906, the Korean Empire decided to establish an agricultural model farm. However, the actual establishment process was led by the Japanese Residency General, and just before its establishment, the name was changed to the Model Farm to Promote Agriculture at the suggestion of Resident General Ito Hirobumi.
The Model Farm to Promote Agriculture and Japanese Agricultural Colonization.
The founding director of the Model Farm to Promote Agriculture was Honda Kosuke, the former professor of animal husbandry at Tokyo Imperial University. Established on April 18, 1906 in Suwon, it served as the Central Agricultural Research Institution in colonial Korea and played a crucial role in introducing Japanese agricultural techniques and rice varieties to Korean farmers. The establishment of the Model Farm to Promote Agriculture was based on the Japanese perception that agriculture in Korea was basically predatory extensive agriculture, outdated from the viewpoint of modern agricultural science. After opening ports, Japanese merchants who dominated the Korean rice market were dissatisfied that Korean rice received poor reputations in Japanese market and could not fetch appropriate prices. They believed that modern farming methods and new varieties should be introduced to Korea to improve the rice quality. They petitioned Japanese politicians to establish an agricultural experimental station on the Korean peninsula. The Japanese government had conducted a land and agricultural production survey throughout the Korean peninsula and planned to establish agricultural testing facilities. The model farm was established in Suwon, Gyeonggi Province in April 1906. Honda was appointed director based on his experience surveying agricultural resources throughout the Korean Peninsula. On January 1st, 1908, the model farm merged with the Suwon Agricultural School, making the director as the principal of the agricultural school. When the Korean Empire lost its sovereignty to Japan in 1910, the model farm officially became part of the Japanese Government General of Korea. The model farm to promote agriculture established branch stations in various regions and began reforming agriculture throughout the Korean Peninsula based on Japanese agricultural science. A Western Korea branch was established in Sariwon, Hwanghae Province in 1919. A Southern Korean branch in Iri, today's Iksan, North Jeolla Province, and a reclamation office in Kimje in 1930. And a Northern Korea branch in Kapsan, South Hamgyong Province in 1931.
The rapid introduction of modern breeding systems.
By the 1930s, a breeding institution system based on Suwon's central station and the regional branches was established, with each branch developing varieties and farming techniques suitable for respective region. This was a direct transplantation of the Japanese mainland system, where regional branches conducted breeding research suited to local characteristics while being supervised by the Central Experiment Station in Tokyo. Among these, the Southern Korea branch in Iri had a very high status, as it was responsible for rice breeding in the Honam Plains, Korea's primary granary. Particularly after 1929, when the model farm to promote agriculture changes its name to the Agricultural Experiment Station and began independent seed improvement project, the Southern Korea branch started developing high-yielding varieties independently, and by the late colonial period became a more significant institution than the main station in Suwon. The introduction of the modern rice breeding system into the colonial Korea occurred with little time lag compared to Japan proper. In Japan, varieties developed through artificial crossbreeding began to show results from 1917, and these varieties began to be widely cultivated from the late 1920s. The systematic distribution of new varieties developed under government supervision to local regions through administrative power only began in the 1930s. This short time gap demonstrates how important the Korean Peninsula was as a food production base for the Japanese imperialism. The first project undertaken by the model farm was to collect and survey native Korean rice varieties. In the early Japanese occupation period, increasing rice yields enough to stabilize domestic rice prices in Japan became the main agenda for breeding on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, the survey was important as preliminary research for the selection and distribution of superior scientific varieties to increase rice production.
Collection and evaluation of traditional Korean rice varieties. Today,
there are few materials that inform us about what kind of rice varieties existed on the Korean Peninsula in pre-modern times. Joseon-era agricultural books mainly discuss rice cultivation techniques, only occasionally mentioning varieties without a comprehensive list. The only exception might be Seoyugu's Imon Gyeongjeji, which introduces 170 types of rice, showing the most detailed record before modernization. However, since these are records from an era when the concept of variety, as defined in modern science, was not established, one cannot simply take it as the number in the pre-modern text as the real number of varieties. Few records remain about how new varieties were developed and propagated during the Joseon dynasty. For several popular native varieties like 조동지 and 석산조, stories circulated among farmers and were recorded by the Japanese researchers. For instance, 조동지 came from its discoverer, 조중식. Based on this, it could be assumed that, just like in other pre-modern societies, farmers in late Joseon Korea likely selected superior varieties based on their experience and distributed them by exchanging seeds among neighboring farms. The Model Farm to Promote Agriculture conducted a massive native seed collection project and created a list of over 1,000 varieties by comparing them with the Joseon Dynasty literature. In 1911 and 1913, the Model Farm conducted 2 surveys of native rice seeds being cultivated by farmers across the Korean peninsula. Japanese researchers grew these seeds in controlled environments at the experimental station to assess their strength and weakness and compared them with Japanese varieties. The resulting list of Korean rice varieties includes around 1,500 varieties. Among these, varieties like 조동지, 석산조, 예조, and 용천조 were widely cultivated for a considerable period, even appearing in agricultural statistics during the Japanese occupation. The Model Farm to Promote Agriculture conducted another massive collection of native rice varieties in 1922, and the result was published in 4 volumes of Korean native varieties, introducing more than 900 rice varieties. Data from a 1931 survey by the Southern Korea branch also listed around 600 regional varieties. The native rice varieties collected by 1933 totaled 5,623.
Cultural resistance to Japanese rice varieties.
After collecting seeds and information on native rice varieties from across the Korean peninsula, the Model Farm to Promote Agriculture began to compare them with Japanese varieties. Although new varieties were known for their high productivity in well-controlled environments like laboratories, in outdoor environments, the traditional varieties actually provided more stable yields that were less affected by weather conditions. In other words, traditional varieties offered more consistent harvest despite potentially reduced overall production. Thus, Korean farmers had to choose between the stability of traditional varieties and the high yield of new varieties. Despite the government general's strong promotion of new varieties, farmers generally seem to prefer native varieties. Farmers' trust in traditional varieties was built through experience over decades or even generations. In contrast, the main rationale for recommending new Japanese varieties was test data obtained from just a few years in a controlled experiment in the station environment. Considering that most Korean farmers at the time were in a marginal situations where the success or failure of a year's farming was directly linked to survival, abandoning varieties they had planted for hundreds of years was a very risky gamble. Fear of famine was a tangible reality, and risk avoidance was more important than profit seeking for farmers. Moreover, the advantages of Japanese introduced varieties could only be realized when various requirements such as fertilizer and irrigation were fully met. Unlike Japan, most agricultural land on the Korean peninsula lacked irrigation facilities and relied on rainfall, so the performance of introduced varieties in actual cultivation was not as enticing as shown in well-irrigated test fields. Additionally, to achieve the increased production, promised by new varieties, large amounts of chemical fertilizers were needed. But for farmers not yet fully integrated into the monetary economy, cash expenditures for fertilizer were a significant burden. Moreover, with the customary tenancy rates reaching 50% at the time, even if tenant farmers spent their own money on fertilizer, it would only benefit the landlords, not the tenant farmers themselves.